Welcome back, everybody. Just wanted to swing by and do a quick main card breakdown for UFC Fight Night Lewis versus Spivac. And this definitely looks like one of the lowest level cards that I can recall. But fights honestly should still be pretty exciting given the lower level nature of it and, a lot of guys trying to fight for their contract. But like I was saying last week, just given some of the time constraints, I wasn't really able to tape just 12 debuting fighters coming off of the Asian regional scene, which is a bit of a crapshoot anyways in terms of the talent and the skill. And going forward, I'm still not quite sure how I want to handle the uploads just yet, but ultimately I do still think I want to get some content out, so I feel like this might be a good middle ground where I cover the main card at least, and then as much of the prelims as I can. Obviously this card, not very possible here. Wasn't really interested in diving that deep into some of these guys anyways, but going forward, I'll try and at least do the main cards and then, get as many of the interesting fights on the prelims as I can into the rest of the breakdowns. But, of course, it is all going to be subject to change, but I'll try my best here. So with that out of the way, let's get right into the breakdowns for the main card for UFC Fight Night, Lewis versus Spivac. So, kicking off the main card, we have Yusaku Kinoshita versus Adam Fugitt, and honestly, this is a pretty low-level fight. Kind of fits with the theme of the card, but we do have a guy in Kinoshita who is going to be making his UFC debut against a guy in Fugitt who is going to be in his second fight, but, he's really more of just a short-notice fill-in that got a contract, so not quite sure if this guy really is even UFC caliber, but Fugitt is going to be the one with one extra fight at the UFC level. But we'll start with the Kinoshita side first. So Kinoshita, a very young guy, is predominantly a striker. He's very aggressive. He's someone who likes to pressure his opponents. And although I feel like he fought kind of wildly on the Contender Series, I think it might have been, him maybe trying to impress Dana and fighting a little different from how he used to fight, because I saw some of his regional fights and it looks like he does fight a little more composed. He does a decent job of, finding openings, picking spots to kind of blitz in. Whereas on the Contender Series, it looked like he might have been a little more reckless. But I think it's also worth noting that he was fighting a much taller, longer guy, so he probably had to take a few more risks there. Not to mention it is, I think it was his first fight over in the States here, so not going to knock him too much for that. But overall, I think that Kinoshita still is, somewhat raw and unpolished, but I can definitely see the potential in him. He's just a bit untested at this point in his career, still very green, still very early in his career. His opponent, Fugitt, on the other hand, does have a few more fights on his record, but I wouldn't say he's that much more experienced than Kinoshita. I believe with Fugitt, his base is in jiu-jitsu. I've seen him really try to push the grappling on the regionals, but it looks like recently he's kind of content to strike. Not a ton of footage, though, and very weird circumstances, obviously. There was this one fight on the regionals. He was just spamming head kicks, and the fight ended pretty quickly. And then in his UFC debut that he took on short notice, he was pretty content to strike with Morales, but it was a short notice fight. He probably wasn't in the best shape. Probably wouldn't have been able to really, aggressively push the grappling anyways. But as far as the striking of Fugitt, he's pretty unorthodox on the feet, actually. He kind of throws these looping shots. The movement's not very traditional. His rhythm and timing also seems a little offbeat, so it could be tough for younger, more unpolished guys to really get a read on him. Because we did see Morales maybe, not struggle, but, it was hard for him to get a great read on him early. Morales obviously won that fight, but, Fugitt, I don't think was getting completely blown out or anything. I did think Morales was winning and getting the better of the exchanges, but I don't think it was a complete domination. In any case, I do think that Fugitt's going to be a pretty interesting matchup here for Kinoshita. I think that the striking, could give Kinoshita some troubles early. He might struggle a bit getting a read on him and maybe get his timing down. But ultimately, I do favor Kinoshita on the feet. He's the much younger guy. I think he's going to be a bit quicker as well. Fugitt's he's actually 34, and I don't think he's like really all that special, if I'm being honest. He seems like a very tough, scrappy guy who's going to fight for your money, but at 34, second fight in his UFC, I don't really see him adding too many more wrinkles to his game, whereas Kinoshita is still very young. Should be improving, and taking his second fight in the States here, I think he's going to be a lot more comfortable going into this fight than maybe his Contender Series fight even. But just in regards to this matchup, I do think that Kinoshita is going to be the quicker guy on the feet, probably the heavier hitter. And this is actually going to be a southpaw versus southpaw matchup here. Fugitt won't have that open stance body and head kick that he likes to throw. And obviously the same is going to go for Kinoshita, but between the two, I feel like Kinoshita is going to be a little more comfortable, fighting on the feet. I can see Fugitt struggling there a little bit more, especially over the course of 3 rounds. Obviously, there's still the grappling aspect. I think that's something that Fugitt could maybe take advantage of. I still think that Kinoshita is still a bit young and green, and Fugitt, he has shown he could push the grappling, at least early in his career. So it could be something he shows up with, and that could make this fight really interesting. But as far as a pick goes for this fight, I think I'm going to go with the younger guy, the quicker guy. And I do believe the UFC is trying to give Kinoshita a bit of a push, whereas with Fugitt, he came in short notice in his last fight. Not really sure if he really even belongs. This guy's probably going to end up just being a bit of a prospect fodder going forward, which is unfortunate because I don't think Fugitt's like a terrible fighter or anything. But as far as this fight goes, I'll go with Kinoshita to pick up a late finish, round 3 TKO. I think we're going to see a bit of damage accumulate for Fugitt, especially if he isn't able to get this fight to the ground, rack up some control time. I do think that, Kinoshita, he's going to be the better attritional fighter. I think that, Fugitt's going to end up eating shots similar to the Morales fight. Obviously, I don't think that Kinoshita is as explosive of a striker as of Morales, but I do think he should be the slightly better striker in this matchup here and should be able to get the better of Fugitt in these exchanges. So give me Kinoshita by round 3 knockout. And next up, we have Choi versus Kyle Nelson, and Choi's the minus 185 favorite. Nelson's the plus 160 underdog, and this should be a banger of a fight. Choi's historically been a very exciting fighter. Nelson, I guess he's a pretty exciting fighter himself in that, a lot of his fights do end in finishes. So this should be a pretty fun one. But of course, I think the big talking point here is going to be Choi making his return after over a 3-year-long layoff. He did have a fight scheduled in between, but apparently I think he had an injury. So obviously I think that's worth talking about here. But, the 3-year layoff is definitely a bit sketchy here. But Choi, he still is a relatively young guy. He's a pretty fun fighter to watch. He's very dynamic. I don't think he's going to be regressing significantly. You do have to worry about the ring rust a little bit here, but I'm not sure if it'll be too big of an issue. He's, again, a very dynamic, very aggressive guy on the feet. He's going to look to pressure opponents and really look to push the action quickly in there. He's sharp. He's quick. He can hang in the pocket a little too long, and, he is someone who looks to kind of just try to get one back. And what I mean by that is it's something a lot of fighters do. It's not super uncommon, but it's just so they don't, I guess, eat a ton of unanswered shots. They try and get the respect of their opponent back a little bit, or really just to try and even out the scorecards a little bit, right? Not to take a ton of unanswered shots, but that's something that I feel like has kind of been his downfall his last few fights. He just fights a little too aggressively in there, hangs around in the pocket a little too long, and is, pretty, I guess, obvious and telegraphed with when he wants to swing back. And, I think other dynamic strikers, other more skilled fighters have been able to really capitalize. However, it is worth noting that this was against some pretty skilled fighters, guys like Stevens and Swanson, who are pretty good guys, and then, as it turns out, Jordan, a pretty solid guy himself, and an absolute dog. So, a pretty tough stylistic matchup for Choi. But, when Choi, he is going offensively, he is able to land some pretty big shots himself, and he is a very potent striker himself. Nelson, on the other hand, is a bit of a finisher himself, but I feel like overall maybe he's just not quite as sharp or quick as Choi. I would say his power or his knockouts are a lot more power based. And Nelson, I feel like, is someone who will load up and look to wing those big shots in there. So that combined with the fact that Choi is coming off of a pretty long layoff, and 2 knockout losses is enough to really make me a little hesitant here. But I do think that skill for skill, Choi is going to be the better fighter, and I feel like as far as a comeback fight goes, this is going to be as easy as you're going to get, right? Nelson, he is 1-4 at the UFC level. Striking defense overall, I'd say, is pretty poor. He does have a tendency to slow down as well in fights. He's throwing big punches in there. He tends to exhaust himself. Granted, Choi has slowed down in his previous fights as well, but overall, this is going to be a big step down in competition for Choi. In his last 3 losses, guys like Jourdain and Stevens and Swanson, I'd say those are all pretty solid UFC level guys. Obviously, Stevens and Swanson back in the day, pretty good fighters. And then Jourdain, as it turns out, is a pretty solid UFC level guy himself, who is a very dynamic and very tough fighter to put away. Nelson, on the other hand, really hasn't looked all that good past the first round. So for me, the pick is going to be Choi. I think we see him pick up an early knockout here. Like I was saying before, Nelson, I think, kind of floats his chin out there quite a bit. I don't think he's, a super chinny or anything, but he has been finished. A lot of his finishes, I feel like, has kind of been a function of him kind of gassing out a bit, and then opponents kind of attritionally finishing him. But Choi, he is very sharp. He is very dangerous early. And I feel like with Nelson's style, he's going to end up getting clipped. Not to say Choi can't get clipped himself. I am a little hesitant with him, coming off of that long layoff. You're going to have to wonder what the timing's going to look like. He did get finished in his last 2 fights as well. I'm not saying his chin's cracked or anything, but someone like Nelson who does throw with power could potentially clip Choi as well. So I do kind of like violence in this fight. Both guys, I'd say, are pretty potent finishers. Both guys do like to get in that firefight. So I kind of do like this fight to end inside the distance, likely by knockout. I feel like once these guys start to meet in the middle, they're going to start swinging, and someone's going to get put out. Obviously, Choi, he is coming off of a pretty long layoff. 2 finishes in a row. He might be a little more tentative, kind of similar to Jai Herbert against Nelson, where Herbert was going into that fight. I think he was like 1-3 at the UFC level. All 3 of his losses by finish, and he ended up just fighting a very safe fight. And maybe Choi does it here, but I'm not too sure. It's not really his style. He's a pretty aggressive guy. So official pick, I'll go with Choi to win by round 1 knockout. And moving along, we have Marcin Tybura versus Blagoy Ivanov. And Tybura's the -150 favorite. Ivanov's the +130 underdog. And we have a couple of older heavyweights going at it. Tybura, actually a year older, but quite a bit more UFC experience, and also going to be the much bigger guy. So we'll start with him first. Tybura, very well-rounded fighter. Solid boxing, decent output. His chin's been dinged a few times, but I don't think that'll be a massive issue here. Ivanov's not a really big hitter by any means, so I don't think there's going to be a big knockout threat coming from Ivanov in this fight. Tybura, he's also a very capable grappler, someone who's very serviceable in the clinch, really good at putting his weight on his opponents, controlling him there, doing a bit of dirty boxing. The cardio's okay. I don't think he's a gasser or anything, but he's not out here setting an insane pace either. So overall, I just think that Tybura is just a very solid, well-rounded fighter, who's actually somewhat consistent as well. So he's someone who could go out there and take advantage of guys who are maybe a bit deficient in a particular area, but I don't think he's going to be making any sort of title push or anything. So just a very solid, very consistent gatekeeper, in my opinion. And he's up against Ivanov, who I'd say is a pretty similar archetype, another guy who's, pretty well-rounded, very technical on the feet, capable of mixing in the wrestling, although I feel like Ivanov doesn't really go to it all that much. He's a little more opportunistic with it. Just still a very crafty veteran, though. But the issue with Ivanov is he is quite undersized. He's given up a lot of height and reach in a lot of his matchups. He's been able to make it work, but he's kind of just been eking by in a lot of these fights, in my opinion. And Ivanov, it's not like he's a completely bricked up guy either. So I do think he's given up a lot of physicality in this fight. And that kind of leads me to my next point. Ivanov just looked really, really bad in his last fight. I'm talking physically and performance-wise. It seemed like he just looked a lot smaller and flatter than he usually does. And he ended up gassing out in that fight against De Lima, of all people. Just a very ugly, very, very sloppy fight. And I know he was coming off of a somewhat long layoff going into that fight. I don't know if it was injury-related or if there was any other extenuating circumstance, but it just really was not a good look, in my opinion. Obviously, I don't want to put too much stock into just one performance. And there's a chance he comes in better shape, looking a lot better for this fight, but maybe there's a chance this guy's just a bit past it, So it's kind of hard for me to really look past that performance for Ivanov. Like, worst case here is he is actually starting to regress a bit and is looking like a shell of himself. Best case, he does return to form, before that fight, but I mean, that's still not very inspiring, if I'm being honest. I've never felt that Ivanov's one that really puts a stamp in fights. He's kind of hard to put away and look great against, but, he's winning very close, dicey split decisions in a lot of these fights, which, I can understand taking him as a big dog if he's able to keep it close, but seeing where the line is starting to trend now, I feel like Tybura, for me, is going to be the side here. Because between the two, Tybura, even though he is a little older, I feel like he's just been a lot more consistent lately. He's been a lot more active. You look at each of his performances, I feel like he's been able to go in there and do what he usually does. Whereas with Ivanov, he won his last fight against De Lima, very sloppy. But the fight before that, he went to a very close split decision against Serghei, a guy who, in hindsight, a bit overrated, a bit overranked, and a lot of people thought that Ivanov should have won that fight, but the fact is it was still a very, very close fight, and that was over 2.5 years ago. The De Lima fight was, about 9 months ago, so pretty long layoffs for Ivanov. Whereas with Tybura, he's been showing up to the octagon, putting in pretty solid performances, and of course, just looking at this matchup, Tybura, he is going to be the bigger guy in there. I think he's going to have a bit of volume advantage. For someone as technical as Ivanov is, he still has a negative striking differential. He still gets volumed up in a lot of his fights. And if a gassy De Lima is able to kind of wall install Ivanov a bit, I feel like Tybura can definitely have a bit more success. I think he can kind of, put his weight on Ivanov a bit, really, make Ivanov tired. So Tybura is going to be the pick for me. I think he's going to abuse his size advantage a bit in this fight. Maybe even try and push the grappling a little bit to pull ahead. So I'm going to go with Tybura here to win a pretty close decision. I know Ivanov historically fights pretty close, but I don't think he's going to get away with it in this fight. So give me Tybura to win by decision. And moving into the co-main event, we have Jung versus Devin Clark, and Jung's the minus 200 favorite. Clark is the plus 170 underdog, and this is a pretty interesting matchup. One I would consider a striker versus wrestler matchup. Jung obviously going to be the guy looking to strike in here. He's going to be the much taller and longer guy. He does a great job of fighting behind the jab. He's got very nice straight punches, very sharp. Does seem to generate quite a bit of power as well. He's also very crafty with how he's throwing his elbows and knees. On paper, his takedown defense looks really good at 88%, but he hasn't really faced a half-decent wrestler so far. In fact, I'd go as far as to say he hasn't really faced anyone good outside of Jacoby, who was able to starch him in the first round. But overall level of competition is still pretty suspect for Jung, right? He's been in there with guys like Khadiz Ibragimov, Mike Rodriguez, William Knight, and Kennedy Nzechukwu, who is probably his best win, but Kennedy, as we know, is a very inconsistent fighter. But beyond that, I don't think he's really been in there with that many good guys, and I feel like a lot of those fights aren't super relevant for this matchup as well. Clark, in my opinion, just a much better wrestler than any of these guys that I just listed, and is far more experienced, but The issue that I have with Clark, or the issues rather, is that Clark, he's pretty undersized for the division, which could be an issue, especially since he is very reliant on having to hit takedowns to win fights, and so he kind of lacks a bit of the physicality to really dominate with his wrestling and grappling. He's not that efficient or effective with controlling opponents or just ground and pounding them. He kind of has to hit takedowns, repeatedly for him to have, extended success. And historically, I feel like he's really only done well in terms of the wrestling and grappling against some really, really low-level guys with really poor defensive grappling. Just taking a quick look at some of his wins, it's over guys like, Jake Collier, Mike Rodriguez, Daquan Townsend, just to name a few guys. Obviously, I don't want to downplay it too much because this is the level of guys that Jung is beating as well. However, going into this matchup, I kind of feel that Jung's takedown defense and defensive grappling is going to be a step up from these guys like, Mike Rodriguez and Daquan Townsend. Just based off of some of the limited footage I've seen from Jung, he does seem to have a decent idea of how to keep fights standing. Again, it's against very low level or very poor grapplers, I should say. But he'll do a decent job of trying to dig for underhooks, frame off. His balance seems okay. I know Ibragimov was able to hit some takedowns on him, but wasn't really able to do too much, and that was just a very hectic fight. And as far as this matchup goes, Jung will have a decent bit of size and physicality advantage, I feel. And from what we've seen with Clark, he has kind of struggled against guys that he hasn't been able to take and hold down. He's also struggled against guys that are just straight up just better grapplers than him, but I don't know if that's going to necessarily be the case here. But I do feel that Jung is going to be a big and long enough guy, a good enough striker that he should be a somewhat tough stylistic matchup for Clark. Usually when Clark is forced to stand with bigger, heavier hitting guys, he's going to struggle a bit. Like we saw in a few of his fights, against guys like Mirzakhanov and Span and Rakic and Blachowicz. He's forced to stand with them for extended periods, and he actually ends up getting finished in these fights. And I'm not saying that Jung is quite on these guys' level, but I feel like he might be a little closer to them than he is to like a Mike Rodriguez or an Alonzo Menefield or even William Knight. So official pick, I'm going to go with Jung here. I feel like there's going to be a pretty big discrepancy on the feet. I feel that Jung is just a bit sharper and a bit more potent with the striking. I would be a little more confident in Jung if I've seen him, repeatedly stuff takedowns and work his way back up. Clark, in my opinion, is going to be the best wrestler that Jung has fought to date. So it'll be interesting to see, how he's going to respond to the takedown attempts. But Clark, in my opinion, isn't even the most aggressive wrestler in there. Sometimes he'll let the fight play out a little longer on the feet than it should, and I feel like he can get discouraged a little bit when he isn't able to convert the takedowns either. So I'm going to lean towards Jung here. I think he's going to be able to keep it long enough on the feet to either find the finish or be able to beat up Clark enough to win the decision here. But official pick, I'm going to go with Jung to get the round 2 knockout. I think that Clark, he may attack the wrestling early, but I think we see Jung either stuff the takedowns or work his way back up and do enough damage to eventually get Clark out of there. So I'm going to go with I'm going to go with Jung to pick up the knockout. I think the submission may even be live here because I do think that Jung's actually got some pretty sneaky front choke series, and if he's able to hurt Clark and Clark is shooting in on a sloppy takedown, we could see a submission as well on the Jung side. But official pick, I'll go with Jung by round 2 knockout. I'm gonna wait and see what the submission prop is, and maybe even play it small there. But official pick, yeah, give me Jung round 2 knockout. And in the main event, we have Serghei Spivac versus Derrick Lewis, and Spivac's the -230 favorite. Lewis is the +195 underdog, and of course, anytime we're dealing with a Derrick Lewis fight, we're dealing with a bit of volatility because with Lewis, obviously, there's a number of outcomes that are all pretty likely with him. We've seen him come from behind knockouts. We've seen him just get beat up and crumble over quickly. We've also seen him win some very uneventful decisions. In fact, Derrick Lewis has actually historically done pretty well in decisions. So A lot of volatility when dealing with Derrick Lewis fights. It's really hard to really, cap this guy and analyze this guy, with a high degree of certainty, just because, he does have that knockout power. He is live to land that knockout at any point. But obviously, we all know this. It's going to be a massive talking point, throughout the week. And, of course, it is a very valid point. So hopefully I can maybe, shed some light on some of the other aspects to his game. So obviously we do know quite a bit about Lewis at this point. The guy's a bit of a nightmare to break down, but, he does have, freakish power. He is capable of hitting that knockout at any point, but he is also capable of kind of just wilting later in a fight. Especially a guy in Lewis who has openly admitted that he doesn't like training for 5-rounders. He doesn't really like training, period. And we have kind of seen him give up in fights as well. So not a particularly great look for him, but he does have that fight-ending power, the equalizer in his hands. So let's talk about Spivac a little bit here. Spivac, in my opinion, definitely one of the better grapplers in the division. Obviously, there's not a ton of grapplers in the division overall, but I do think that Spivac is pretty skilled, and he is very dangerous, especially if he is able to get on top of you. On top of that, he's still quite young. He's racking up the experience, and from what it looks like, it does look like he's a bit more comfortable with the striking, at least in recent fights. We saw in the Serghei fight he was a little more aggressive on the feet. He might have maybe just not respected the game of Serghei all that much either, so he was able to kind of just walk Serghei down, throw punches and bunches, and eventually get the fight to the ground with, pretty good success there, and was able to eventually find the finish. So Spivac, in my opinion, definitely on a bit of an uptrend. He's making improvements fight to fight. He's looking good, and he still is relatively young. But it is worth noting that he is beating a lot of lower-level guys, in my opinion, guys who have very little or no grappling defense. Just looking over some of the guys he's beaten, guys like Augusto Sakai, as it turns out, just terrible on the ground. Greg Hardy, Jared Van Der, Carlos Felipe, and Tai Tuivasa, all guys with, negative grappling defense. Obviously, the Tuivasa win's probably the win that's aged the best, but again, Tuivasa not really known for his ground game at all. And the rest of the guys on the list just not very impressive whatsoever. And I know people are going to argue that Derrick Lewis is not a prolific defensive grappler either, right? Derrick Lewis giving up a ton of takedowns. The guy gives up a ton of control time. But outside of DC, nobody's really been able to just completely wash Lewis out on the mat. A lot of guys have been able to take him down and even hold him down, but what happens in those fights, right? A lot of the times, Lewis is able to kind of explode out, get up, and win just very hairy decisions, or even just get the knockout. And a lot of the time that these guys are taking Lewis down, they're really not able to do too much in terms of the ground and pound. Derrick Lewis is just such a big, strong, physical guy that, if they start to posture up, Lewis is going to find openings to kind of just explode out and work his way back up, which I think is actually a somewhat underrated skill. I feel like a lot of people don't give him enough credit for being able to recognize these situations and kind of just, get back to his feet. Like, I feel like Lewis does a really good job of just leveraging his size and explosiveness and knowing when to explode out of positions to work his way back up. And on the feet, he's usually going to be the one throwing the way more impactful shots, the way more effective shots as opposed to his opponents. Kind of just laying on top of him for a few minutes and maybe just throwing a few, pitter-patter body shots there. With that being said, though, I do think that Spivac's going to be one of the more skilled grapplers that Lewis has fought. And if Spivac is able to get on top of Lewis, I definitely can see Spivac having a bit more success than a number of the other wrestlers that Lewis has faced. Probably not on a level of a DC, but still better than a lot of the other guys that have been able to take Lewis down. But in any case, I don't think it'll be easy to take him down, especially early. I do think that when Lewis is fresh, he's actually got pretty solid takedown defense. He's still a very strong, very physical guy. And, Lewis, he does have pretty good timing on his strikes. He does have a nice uppercut. He will try and mix in the flying knees as well. He tries to time those. And so if Spivac, if he's a little too telegraphed with his shots, he could get caught with something. And Spivac, in my opinion, not a guy with a fantastic chin, and with Ngannou gone, I feel like you can make the argument that Lewis is probably the heaviest, if not one of the heaviest hitters in the division. So early on, I'd say the first round and a half, maybe 2 rounds, it's going to be, I think, a little dicey for Spivac, but I feel like as the fight starts to drag on, it's going to be very heavily in favor of Spivac, in my opinion, especially when he does start to get the grappling going. I just don't have that much confidence in Lewis at this stage in his career. This guy's openly stated that, he doesn't want to fight in 5-rounders. He doesn't want to train for 5-rounders. He doesn't really like to train in general. I know there's some pictures circulating of him looking like the best he's ever looked, but we often see this a lot. Fighters, they look the best they've ever looked, but once you get back into the octagon, you kind of revert to some old habits. If he doesn't find the knockout early, I can see Spivac starting to take over, and if he's on top of Lewis and he's just throwing some ground and pound, I could kind of see Lewis just maybe shell up in there and look for a way out, maybe give the neck or something. But in the 5-rounder, I think the deeper it goes, the more I favor Spivac. But early on, I do think that Lewis is going to be a massive knockout threat. I think that if he is able to stuff some early takedowns and really make Spivac hesitant in there, I feel like Lewis could definitely line him up for something. It'll also be kind of interesting to see if Lewis is going to be able to explode out of these positions like he has before. I do think that it's going to be a bit tougher because, Spivac, I do think is, very good positionally. I do think he's a very skilled grappler, so it'll be tough for Lewis to just stand up like he usually does. And if he isn't able to do that, I really see Spivac being able to take over rounds 3, 4, and 5. So official pick, I think I'm going to go with Spivac to win by round 4 submission, maybe even TKO. I think Spivac is just going to have a little more left in the tank come those later rounds. Lewis, as we know, might get a little discouraged in there. He might try something crazy early in the round, but I feel like, later in the fight, if Spivac is able to convert on a takedown, he's going to look for the finish. So give me Spivac to win by round 4 TKO, but I do kind of like this fight to go under. I just think that early on we could see Lewis find the knockout, and later in the fight, I think we could see Spivac find the finish as well. But official pick, I'll go with Spivac to win by round 4 TKO. And that'll do it for this episode of the podcast. Not quite sure how to cap it off, but I did realize that I largely just picked favorites for the main card here. So I'm going to do something a little different, maybe just for this episode, maybe for future episodes as well. Not really sure, but I'm just going to rate the underdogs that I have, that I think have the biggest chances of pulling off the upset for this main card here. Obviously, it could look really, really bad in hindsight, but I'm just going to do something a little fun, a little different to end off this podcast. So let's just run right through it real quick here. So between these 5 guys, I think Derrick Lewis probably has got the biggest shot to pull off the upset, in my opinion. The guy's just a big knockout threat. Spivac, might not have the physicality early to take Lewis down, and I feel like Lewis absolutely could land a bomb early in this fight. Obviously, like I was saying before, later on, I do expect Lewis to kind of wilt in there, but early on, I really do think that Lewis is pretty live to get the knockout, actually. So, number 1, Derrick Lewis. Number 2, I think I'll go with Ivanov. This is a bit of a toss-up between Ivanov and Clark. The main thing is just the experience, right? Both guys have kind of been around at the UFC level. Ivanov shown that he's a guy that's kind of hard to put away. He's going to be hard to look great against. So I feel like he could definitely pull off the upset just by virtue of how he fights, just fighting close, making fights 50-50. So I feel like, he's probably the second most likely to pull off an upset if it were to happen here. And then I'm going to go with Clark 3 just because we are dealing with a pretty interesting style dynamic here. Obviously, I do still favor Jung to win, but if it turns out that he's just not able to really stuff takedowns and work his way back up, I do think that Clark could end up looking like, a moderate favorite here. But overall, I think those chances are pretty slim here. And really, the only reason that I'm going to take Clark at 3 here is just because I feel like he's a, somewhat more proven guy than the other 2 guys that are underdogs like Nelson or Fugitt, which will bring me to number 4 here, and that's going to be Adam Fugitt. I just think that this is a low enough level fight where, he could potentially exploit some holes in his opponent in Kinoshita. So for that reason, I think that Fugitt, he could be live for something, especially given potential, stylistic matchup dynamic here, especially he's able to push the grappling. But ultimately, this is a pretty low level fight, and I'm kind of just banking on a bit of variance, in this fight if Fugitt does pull it off. And lastly, we have Kyle Nelson, who I just think he's going to get knocked out in this fight, if I'm being honest. I think there's a pretty decent skill discrepancy between the two. Obviously, both guys very dynamic, very big hitters. So, there's going to be some volatility, but I do think that Choi's just the more skilled guy. He's been in there with, I think, better fighters. He's given better account of himself, against better fighters. Whereas with Nelson, he does really only have that first round in him, I feel like. So outside of him just landing something big on Choi, or maybe Choi just completely punching himself out early, it's kind of hard for me to see Nelson win here. But who knows? Maybe he is able to land something big early. But out of these 5 guys, I have the least amount of confidence in Nelson, I'd say. So, yeah, just ranking these dogs, I just go Lewis, Ivanov, Clark, Fugitt, and then Nelson. So that'll officially wrap up this episode of the podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Best of luck with your guys' bets and picks. And I'll catch you guys next week for the UFC 284 card.